Welcome everybody for another conversation on the future of work and human-computer interaction. As we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation for partially funding this effort, as well as co-organizers, board chairs here with me today, and then Linda Boyle, John Lee, Rafaela Sadoun, and Manfred Chalagi. And this is a recorded conversation. And please put your questions in the chat if you could, or it will be moderating those. So I'd like to say welcome to Stacy Branham. Welcome, Stacy. Stacy's an assistant professor in informatics at the University of California, Irvine. Her research investigates how technologies operate in social settings where one or more people has a disability. Her recent and ongoing studies explore how technology can isolate, offend, and harm people with disabilities as much as it has the potential to integrate and empower them with when designed properly. And I'd also like to say that Stacey's in an adjunct chair for accessibility on the SIC Executive Committee where we serve together. So welcome, it's wonderful to have you. And I wanted to start with this idea that that shows up in this 2018 paper that you co-authored in Assets. And you're looking at this idea of interdependence versus independence when it comes to designing for people with disabilities, or designing for anybody really. So can you tell us more about that idea?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And I'm joined here by a few of my students, Ali Abdurrahmani, Kevin Storr, Emery Edwards, who I'll definitely be calling on throughout our discussion to help me talk about the work we've done together. But this paper about interdependence is, it's actually one of my favorites. So you might have to cut me off as I talk about it. You know, when I first started as a postdoc with Sean Kane in 2014. I'd never done any accessible computing research. And instead, my dissertation had been about how technology mediates intimate partnerships. And so when I joined him, I was thinking in this frame of like how people work together through technology. But I noticed immediately that the accessible computing field was still doing most of its work in what some people would call the first or second paradigm of computing, where they were thinking a lot about how do we make machine and human fit, especially with disability, when there's something a little different about that person. How do we make the machine work for them? And moreover, how do we make one person with one computer in this kind of isolated little bubble work together? But in my CSCW frame, I was thinking, whoa, this is all happening in context. Where are people with disabilities in context? Who are the other actors around them? What other social factors are coming into play? And so when I noticed that the word interdependence was being used to talk about the goal of the technology that we're building, of the assistive technology, I was really surprised at how that might cut out this notion that people are all kind of interconnected or interdependent, if you will. And so sort of naively, I came in and I was like, oh, and in my very first paper, I wanted to have like a section in the discussion about interdependence. And my mentor, Sean, at the time was like, no, that's opening up a big can of worms. And I didn't quite understand. And so, you know, it turns out the term independence is deeply fundamental to the disability rights movement. And actually, I was wondering if Kevin, if I can put you on the spot a little bit, just tell us a little bit about why independence is so important so that I can share with the audience why interdependence is important, but also isn't the end all be all of how we think about accessible computing.
Sure, thanks, Stacy. So the notion of independence actually gets adopted and promoted by disability activists during like the 1960s. And it's a response to a century of incarcerating disabled people in institutions like asylums. So like asylums we see on TV, they have these horrific portrayals of people like Nurse Ratched is very popular right now, like abusing disabled people. And the unfortunate thing is that this is not just a horror movie trope. these kinds of things actually happen. And so the independent living movement arises as kind of a response to this abuse, and independence is a value placed in opposition to being incarcerated, being under someone else's control and abuse, being able to make one's own life decisions. And so I guess in that context, like, we realize that the notion of independence that Stacy's work challenges is like maybe not really what was meant in the first place anyway, right? Like, independence is more akin to autonomy and like civil rights and like being able to assert your own agency into your life in response to this deeply abusive system that existed in North America from the mid 19th to 20th century.
Absolutely. So well said. Kevin just submitted a paper about like kind of interrogating independence and institutionalization and what that means for how we do research going forward, which is why you said that so much more eloquently than I could have. But, so independence is really more about self-determination, but the way that we talk about it in accessible computing, it kind of collapses it into this idea that, well, it's really has been unarticulated. No one really defines it, we just use it. And so I think a challenge there is that we need to make sure independence doesn't mean that people with disabilities are doing work by themselves, without other people around. And so interdependence, just very briefly, it brings together work of Cynthia Bennett and Aaron Brady and myself, where we observe how interdependent, how people with disabilities are working with other people with disabilities, with people without disabilities, with very creatively with the tools they have at their disposal to create access. Access is like, it's a living thing. It's not just something you can embed in a tool and say, haha, it's accessible now because the technology's there, right? So it helps us to look at this larger social context, and it helps us see people in relation. It helps us see that people with disabilities are not just on the receiving end of care and help. They actually create care and help for themselves with each other. And it helps us understand that they're in relation with other people. So here's like a silly example from my house. I'm 6 feet tall. My husband's 5'10". I know he can't reach the top shelf in the kitchen. And so whenever we're cooking together, I just automatically go up and get it for him. And that's a very like easy thing to do in our relationship, because we have multiple ways in which we help each other and build access for each other, right? And so it's that natural to be working together to create access. And I think ultimately, when we think about things from an interdependent standpoint, which, by the way, we're borrowing this term from disability studies and feminist studies, and disability rights activists, that we're actually trying to break down these hierarchies of ability and suggest that people with disabilities aren't just receiving, they're giving and they're creating access together. And we need to look at the social context when we do research and design for accessible computing.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about blind people, and you talked about observing how people work today, how people function today, and you have an interesting paper exactly on this, on experiences at the workplace. So how do blind people today, what do they find at the workplace? How do they work? And what have you learned from this assets paper? Or what did you report on?
This is one of my very first papers. We were just looking in workplaces. Believe it or not, people hadn't really just kind of looked. I've done observational field studies where we see how people with visual disabilities are working, mostly, in context where everyone else around them isn't blind or visually disabled. And I want to also say, like, our sample's very skewed towards the very most privileged blind people who have jobs and have supports in their jobs to do their work. But basically, they work like everyone else of us, but they use some different tools. And barriers that arise for them are things like, well, maybe the accommodations that they're owed legally are not actually given to them. So, for example, in one case, a blind employee didn't have access to JAWS, which is kind of the state-of-the-art screen reader software that allows them to turn any 2D display, like the one you're looking at now, into linear text, synthesized text, so that they can interact with it. And they only had like a free trial license that would expire like every 30 minutes. And some of the coworkers would accidentally turn it on and off. And so the point is that you didn't really have access to the computers in the lab. Another thing that might happen is just kind of everyday inaccessibility, like the phone system you use in your office has a blinking red light that has no audio sound accompanied with it. So you don't know if there's a message waiting for you. And there's social implications to that. People all of a sudden think that you're lazy, you don't check your mail, you don't follow up with them, you're unresponsive. There might be settings where you're working with specialized equipment or software. So one of our participants was working with like MRI scans, and how do you make like that software is just not accessible, and the imagery that it portrays is inaccessible. There can be incompatibilities with your accessible technology like JAWS or NVDA, your screen reader, and other specialized technologies that you're kind of the guinea pig, and you find it out, you have to find workarounds for it. Even things like, where's the fire extinguisher? Where's the emergency exit? Oh, there's a duck and cover room. I had no idea. There's just a sign on the door. No one ever told me about it. Things like company culture. Oh, there's some free candy on the table. No one tells you what it is or where on the table it is, or your little tchotchkes and memorabilia on your desk, so you can kind of strike up a conversation and get to know who your coworkers are. It can be isolating to use your screen reader and have to put in your headphones or leave them out and have to close your door, and not because you don't want to bother your coworkers, but then it seems like you're closed off. So there's myriad issues that came up that required, honestly, a lot of it is about the fact that people in the office don't always know how your technology works or the needs that you have. And so they're kind of actively but unintentionally working against you, like, leaving the door to the kitchen's shared dishwasher down, and then you like not knowing whether it's clean or dirty, you tripping over it, right? So those are just kind of some samples of the things that we saw. And actually, Ali, you are a blind screen reader user. You work as a graduate student every day, and we encountered kind of an example that just a couple of weeks ago during your final defense that maybe would be relevant here. Do you mind sharing it?
Of course, sure. Yeah, this is, the challenge is that when technology comes to role a play for you to help you communicate with others effectively, there are two things. There are some challenges that, for example, we had this problem with WebEx. I wanted to share my audio and video of my computer to present a video on my presentation defense, but it easily conflicted with my screen reader, because if I wanted to enable that, then everybody in the room would also hear the screen reader spoken output, which was, of course, not acceptable. And it was really, I don't say exciting or like surprising, how difficult it was for me to like change the audio setting on WebEx without it conflicting with my screen reader. So when I showed the number of steps that I have to take to Stacy, hey, I need to do all these steps in the middle of the presentation to share my audio with WebEx, and then again, check that tick off in order to listen to my screen reader, we decided, okay, bring your microphone near to the output of the speaker and play the video. Through that, people can see the video and listen to the audio of your presentation that you need through the sound being captured by microphone. And easily, we decided to, maybe to some extent bring down the level of professionality that I had to use in my final defense. if that is short enough for you, Stacy.
Oh my God, it's perfect. And the other thing is that like there's this huge communication barrier to your colleagues about just how much work you have to do in order to make this happen and why it's so hard to troubleshoot. And it can, there's that burden placed on the employee to figure out, is this something that I want to mention to my superiors or my colleagues or not? I don't want to seem like I'm a constant complainer. I want to be a troubleshooter. I want to be able to solve these things. But we even went to the point of calling this the invisible work of accessibility because of all the additional labor and knowledge work that people with disabilities have to do just to accomplish basic tasks in the course of their everyday jobs. That's a term we're borrowing from a sociologist. I think it's Arlene Daniels, but also it's something that was popularized in HCI by Lucy Suchman. And I think it really applies here. And the truth of the matter is what we really need is not just the right tools in the office place, but we also need the colleagues and the other people working around people with disabilities to be informed and to understand, so that when a person with a disability has a challenge, they can turn to them and ask for help, and they may know the answer, or they're just understanding, or they're going to go ahead, take a step ahead and make things accessible from the start, like accessible PDFs. Make sure my PDF is accessible before I send it out, right?
That's very interesting, and thanks, Ali, for sharing. That is indeed a lot of labor, and indeed it goes invisible. So thank you for sharing that. Now, to continue along these lines, so one place I think, Stacy, where you see an opening is the voice-activated personal assistants, and these might act as indeed your assistants, right? And I think one thing you mentioned is how these assistants could be really gateways to various applications, but it sounds like, of course, that's not quite working out. And it really reminds me that we keep having this problem in all kinds of different fields, from communication between first responders all the way to communicating with different apps, which is this various versions of interoperability not quite being there. Is that how you see it too?
Oh, absolutely. So VAPAs, as we lovingly called them, but now we've simplified to voice assistants. Think like Google, Siri, Echo. I actually stepped back into this research area, which has become very popular over the past few years, and I owe that all to Ali. So I'm going to actually hand it over to Ali again, because this is a stream of research that came completely from him.
Thank you, Stacy. So yeah, the story actually began in fall 2017. So as a legally blind person, I received a birthday gift from two of my generous friends. I got a Google Home from them. And I was so excited because I had heard about these, but I didn't own one. So easily I downloaded Google Home app on my iPhone, and using VoiceOver screen reader on my iPhone. It was really easy to set up. And also right after setting it up, so no screens, no touch screens, all voice. I was so excited. Ooh, that's perfect for a blind person. It should be very easy to use. But after a while, I realized, there are some things that I don't like, and I expect it to be different. For example, the verbosity of the responses was, it was so verbose sometimes. Or even I said, sometimes I like these technologies, like speak to me faster, because as a blind person, I'm used to higher speech rates. Then when I looked into the literature, I saw, nobody has looked into this problem that much, at least about people with visual impairments or in the blind community, while this seems to be a very natural and perceivable technology for them, because it's all about audio modality, it's all about voice. So when we looked into this problem, we found it very interestingly that the genre of voice interaction, for example, at least in 2017, was all around using these technologies for simple conversational tasks, entertainment stuff, but not for like productive tasks as blind people expected when we did like an interview study followed by a podcast analysis study to understand blind podcasters' perspectives about usage of these technologies. And then many interesting themes that we found was, yeah, these interaction modality, these voice assistants, mainstream voice assistants, could be used beyond this simple like entertainment or conversational task. And even in their paper, Stacy with our colleague actually also found that like many commercial guidelines are also following this thing, and they don't go beyond a human model of conversation. So one of the things that we found really interesting in what blind people expected, they said, you know, voice assistants can be used as an intermediary between many applications or interfaces that are currently poorly accessible or totally inaccessible, like, for example, touch screens at home, or even like, you know, different mobile applications that are not accessible. As an example, because I was familiar with kind of indoor navigation research, we wanted to see what other contexts, for example, these technologies are useful. Like for indoor navigation, interestingly, we found that, for example, in airports, which is a kind of complicated indoor navigation space, even not only blind people, but also sighted people found it so interesting to use a voice assistant as a mainstream technology with them to help them navigate in those complicated situations, meaning that these mainstream technologies can also be extended such that a broader population can take advantage of them, which are, of course, more affordable. They don't like bring in any social stigma that is associated with like specialized assistive technologies that we all know in accessible computing. We're talking all about that. So I believe this is a place that we can start looking at what other work environments, like what other work contexts we can use these technologies for, bring in these kind of technologies to help not only people with disabilities, but also maybe a broader population.
Right, absolutely. Like, I think that we are so obsessed as a culture, as a community of engineers, with this idea that voice assistants are going to be our companions. They're going to be, you know, that we're going to reach, you know, this singularity in which we can not decipher the difference between our computers and ourselves. And I don't think that that necessarily serves us well. Yes, maybe it's a kind of exciting expression of what we can achieve through computing, but at the same time, I don't want my mouse to talk to me. I really appreciate that I can kind of, in a transactional way, make it point, as a sighted person, make it point to something on the screen and click, and within milliseconds, I've been able to, you know, communicate with it. And I think that we are kind of conflating the capability of the voice assistant to understand natural language and then speak it back to me, with the value of that in all situations. And so, you know, Elise came up with this idea that we need multimodal voice assistants so that I can choose whether to speak to it in this moment, or to tap or swipe on the screen in this moment, or to have, maybe instead of vocal feedback, to have an ear con feedback or some other audio tactile feedback. And I think once we start thinking about the voice assistant as more transactional interface, and that has flexibility to be more human-like, or more, you know, just kind of like a computer middle person, or kind of like a peripheral device that that will be able to kind of see beyond it just being like another the Jetsons Rosie robot for us in the house, and being able to kind of coordinate housework. So I'm really excited that Ali's work is showing us a use case for taking voice assistants outside of the home and bringing them into public spaces, maybe airports, and also leveraging the fact that they're kind of naturalistically accessible for many people, older adults, children, people with visual disabilities, and making it a mainstream technology so that it's not something that's isolating or stigmatizing. And most importantly, it's affordable because there are economies of scale at work.
Yeah, that's super. There are several people here who are in the automotive domain, and certainly in the automotive domain, we think a lot about speech interaction, because if you're driving, then you probably shouldn't be tapping things or reading things. And so,
sorry, I'm laughing because one of the first things I did once I learned about the voiceover accessibility feature on my phone is while I was commuting to work, I would tap and swipe to listen to web pages and papers on my way to work.
yeah,
And I actually thought that was very appropriate, because I would just do like a tap tap. It was non-visual and like handling the radio, honestly.
yeah. Well, that makes sense, right? I think what I really meant to say is, typing away or reading pages and so forth. So I think that we've thought a lot about how voice interactions from simply giving you directions all the way to interacting with you might be useful. And then one of the really neat things about this work is that you also looked at specifically work, right? Which people in podcasters, blind podcasters. And so since we're talking about work, I wonder if you can comment on the very specific ideas regarding the work that they do and how they felt about voice assistants.
Oh, well, so we didn't quite look at podcasters and their work settings. Rather, the interesting thing there is we found that podcasts were kind of like this untapped data source, extant source, where blind people were trying to tell the world about the accessibility or inaccessibility of technology tools. And we just realized we should be listening. We should be listening. They want us to listen. They want to spread the word to other blind people. And maybe we shouldn't be harassing people to give us interviews before we go out and just listen to some blind podcasters who are reviewing tech. But they were working in many different contexts. And because voice assistants tend to be used in the home, they would say things like, well, I like it in my home. I'd like it to be, expanded so that it could talk to my speakers, as well as my washer and dryer, as well as my fill in the blank. But also they would talk about how they wanted to be able to do more work productive things with it. Like I like to schedule my work schedule in my calendar with my voice assistant, but it's just not, nuanced enough for me to be able to set up like a recurring meeting. And et cetera. So, and there's no way to edit. I wish that can you do word processing with your voice assistant? I would like to be able to jump back and forth, and I'd like to be able to check that I've spelled things correctly, because if in a professional context, I don't want to be having typos in my messages to my boss, et cetera. So we did find that. And overall, what this whole process taught us is that we need to have people with disabilities involved in the process of design of technologies from the beginning. I mean, Ali came up with this brilliant idea that voice assistants could be the next massively mainstream, massively accessible platform. And we should be leaning into it. And not only that, because people who are blind have this expertise about how to interact effectively through voice and audio channels, we should be including them in the audio design of these technologies and be asking them about the potential ways we can expand them into new domains, because they're already thinking about it. And so that's actually where we came up with this title of Blind Leading Sighted. We're tired of hearing blind leading the blind, as if they don't know how to, I mean, some of my blind friends know more about where I'm going than I do. They would usually be my Google Maps when I was driving around the DC area. And so the idea that actually we should be following the guidance and the recommendations and the design inputs of, say, blind people from the beginning of product design really came from, first of all, my inspiration from Ali for coming up with this project idea, from the podcasters, and all the new kind of directions that their insights have opened up to us.
Yeah, I just love that title. So, well, this is really wonderful. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Ali, for jumping in. And I think, Orit, do you want to?
Yes. So I want to start with my question. And we talked earlier before we start recording about the beginning of this conversation series. And one of the motivations for us to start this series was the immediate impact that work from home had on our life, and kind of our motivation is the future of work is already here. Let's have conversations with experts. So I'm wondering, within the context of people with disabilities, and specifically with blind users, and this particular technology, what was the impact, or what do you anticipate is the impact of working from home and the potential of these technologies in this particular environment?
Oh my goodness, what a great question. And I'm gonna, again, ask my students to help me with this, but I just have mostly anecdotes. We're running a study right now where we're providing some free accessibility tools to people with disabilities in the local LA and Orange County areas. And I think one of the fruits of that study will be that we'll understand some of the on the ground issues they're facing. But just so far, what we've seen is that, you know, on the one hand, it can be really helpful to not have to commute someplace. For a blind person, you know, I had a friend in the DC area who found her dream job in Baltimore, but was like, there's just no way I can do that commute by, you know, patching together all the kind of ride services and public transit from here to there. It would mean 2 hours each way for me, and it's really expensive, you know. So transportation to and from work, and the belief that like you need to be there in person can be really, really limiting. And another thing is that there, as you heard from Ali, like Ali is an expert in Zoom. We've had Zoom long before COVID came around because we realized it was a very accessible platform for him, but and for all of us. But when he has to transition to WebEx, there's this like whole new set of like quirks and features that he's got to sort through, and whether they're accessible or not. So just the fact that there might be multiple new platforms for you to engage with, and there's probably even, Ali, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, but probably even like a lack of knowledge that had to be built up within the blind and disabilities communities in general around like which platforms actually work for us. We've never tried this, you know, gather.town before. Does it work for us? And then they have to educate all the sighted people about whether that's accessible, and it's not. So I think there's just like a whole bunch of trade-offs, and because it's a whole new world, there's a lot of labor being put in by people with disabilities to figure out what works and what doesn't, and then to have to communicate that and advocate for that within their communities. I'm going to open it up to Kevin, Emery, Ali. Do you have other?
So maybe I can kind of add kind of just elaborate a little bit as your student jumping into answer, but just from the little story that Ali shared about his dissertation and the WebEx, I kind of was exposed to a level of expertise that I was not aware before, as you said, kind of invisible. And Ali is obviously an expert and a PhD student in the kind of human-computer interaction domain. How do you even train people who don't have this expertise to use these tools?
So that's really a good, I think that's a very insightful point, because one of the challenges that I believe currently exists in a corporate level or in a social level is how can we bring the insights of people in different user groups, to bring their insights or their education level about each other's needs close to each other, to understand that. Communicating that need is really difficult sometimes. Even, for example, when I want, for example, Stacy and I have been working, I think, maybe for 6 years. But sometimes even still, I find myself a little bit in a hard situation because I don't understand how she looks the screen, and maybe she doesn't well know what I mean, for example, by this. If I use this term using my screen reader or whatever, how can I communicate that to her? So if I want to talk a little bit more generally, is I think one thing which is really missing is how we can communicate features of a platform, or like a digital application like Zoom or WebEx, or even we can extend it to other areas too, how we can bring everyone on the same page regarding the needs or the way that they can talk about the features for that specific user group, for example. This is, I think, obviously an important aspect that should be considered, regardless of even expertise of the person who is going to use that technology or who is going to communicate through that technology. Sometimes, for example, I try to, hey, there is this button on the screen that says this. And for example, my sighted wife say, I don't see that button. There is no button with this title. And later I understand, oh, that was the descriptive text of the graphic. It's a graphic button and she's seeing the icon. And I'm saying, for example, it's a, for example, share button, but there is no word like share on that. There is like an icon. So these are all, I think, communication problems that should be addressed for any technology, including these like maybe communication or like digital tools that we use in a collaborative manner, if that answers.
Yes, thank you. This is very, very insightful.
And I think there's also an element in a lot of workplaces where people just don't know what accessible technology is out there or what different disabilities kind of need. So there's almost like an empathy gap between like sighted or non-disabled designers who think, oh, blind people are out there, they do other stuff, they aren't actually in my workplace, I don't work with them. And there's an element of making sure that people who are in technology design roles understand or imagine their users and their colleagues as being people with disabilities. And so, we're looking at ways that users and representations of users in the design system can actually reinforce the idea that you should be imagining a very diverse population of people who could potentially be using your technology, and actually integrating into the design process the idea that, again, a mainstream technology should be thinking about accessibility from the beginning, rather than this kind of very last minute, like, oh, I guess now with user testing, I'm finding out this one thing, if I even happen to do user testing with people with disabilities. But if you have like a blind person in your workplace, or you have the idea that you have an expert on accessibility in every team, then that allows you to really understand what those issues are, or potential issues are, from the beginning.
Thank you. So I would like to follow up on that, but I'm going to kind of ask Leon to ask his question first. And if you have any questions, by the way, raise your hand and I'll call on you. Leon?
Hi, my question is a bit like left field from the discussion that we're having right now. But I was wondering, just are there ever scenarios that you might have come across where voice or audio / tactile are not modalities that could be used for communication or information? And if you have, like, what did you think about that? How do you address that?
Oh, go ahead.
I didn't quite catch the question. Can you repeat this?
Yes, of course. So I guess I'll give you the context that I actually was hinting towards. I'm actually interested in looking at early music learners who might be blind or low vision. And if you're playing music, you can't actually use voiceover or audio for feedback, say for reading music at the same time. And obviously your hands also engaged in like playing an instrument, for example. So I was just kind of curious about what are the modalities in terms of like haptics or just things that might be out there, or your thoughts on it?
I think that's a really brilliant question. There is, I think, a vast area of research regarding usage of haptic, and tactile feedback to convey even spatial information to blind users. So I believe that, of course, because music and voice at the same time definitely would conflict with each other, I think there is a lot of room to understand the level of the feasibility of using haptic and tactile feedback to convey the necessary, meaningful and essential information for that purpose, for sure. And even I think the idea of using tactile feedback or haptic feedback around different, maybe using them as wearables to convey this information is also very important, especially regarding the fact that you said even the hands are occupied maybe with playing music. So that would be by itself an important area of research to see how much beneficial it is, how usable it is, or, depending on the capacity of the modality channels that a person can process in parallel.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Ali, you did some work with Amy Hurst and Ravi Kuber about situational impairments and disabilities. So the idea is that, even though you may not have a permanent disability or even a chronic or short-term disability, you may have moments where you are temporarily disabled. So for me, that's back when I used to go to campus, I would have my bicycle in one hand and then a coffee in another and be trying to get through the door to up to my office. And so I would elbow the little actuator that would open the door automatically. Of course, that actuator is put there for people in wheelchairs, but many of us find utility in that, right? And the point is that I was like, I'm situationally disabled or impaired. And the paper that you wrote, Ellie, was brilliant because it talked about the ways in which people with permanent disabilities, like a person who is blind, also has situationally induced impairments. Like what if you've got the coffee in your hand and your book's in another and you're trying to get through the door? And one of those that's pretty typical is that if you are a white cane user or a guide dog user, that you're holding the harness or you're holding your cane and maybe you even have your phone in another hand. And so you have to really be cognizant of not just like, what's the cognitive capacity of this person? It's like, no, what is their like situational what sort of context do they find themselves in? What are they holding in their hands at the time? What else do they need to be paying attention to? You can't stick a vibrational device on their white cane because they need to feel the vibrations from the cane of the floor. So you really need to be involving people with disabilities and talking about what they naturalistically have in their hands and what they're already thinking about as they're, say, on the go or doing a task.
Thank you. So I have one last question, kind of going back to Stacy, your discussion of commute, and we have quite a few people here from the Auto UI community. So I'm wondering, in a future in which we have kind of a safe self-driving car that maybe doesn't even have a driver's seat, how does it make an impact on individuals that are blind? And for example, one thing that we're thinking a lot is how can we make this self-driving car or highly automated car a place in which you can catch up on work on the way to work, or a place that perhaps could be a place to disengage from work as you're commuting back. As we're starting to think about these designs, what should we consider for people who is different visual impairments or people that are blind?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question, and I have a very bad answer for you because I don't specialize in this area, but I'm aware of some scholars. Like I know that oh, I'm seeing her face. Her name will come to me in just a moment. Robin Brewer at University of Michigan, and some other scholars have been actually talking to people who are blind about self-driving cars and automated cars. And what's really interesting is you would expect that they'd be very excited about this kind of universally, but they're not. Because, for example, they want to make sure that they have access to see an accident coming and avoid it, and have agency in making decisions about how the car is reacting. And so there needs to be some really, mostly because it's like, well, I might be legally liable. Like I'm technically in the driver's seat and the car was on auto drive, then, you know, I might be liable, and I might have like, just like an ethical kind of obligation to be involved in that. And so I would say it's really, really tricky. So whenever you're designing the systems, try to recruit some blind folks to just talk with. So yeah, I feel a little bit guilty like saying what they need, but I can just say I don't know what they need, and that's why we need to talk with them.
I think that's a very good point. I just want to mention that Dr. Robin Brewer will be with us next week. So
incredible. And I don't know if Ali or Kevin or Emery have anything to add to that. Basically the glorified I don't know answer.
In the longer scale, I guess I also have no idea about autonomous vehicles, I should say, but I think the focus on the transit to work as a barrier to work for disabled people, I think for me was like, oh, we're working from home. This kind of connects back to the work from home, the future's here kind of question, and I got really excited about it, of course, because I'm thinking, oh, you know, like disabled people have had to work from home for a long time. Many of them can't commute. Like this is building the bridges. But on the social side of things, I get concerned, I guess, about the lack of assistive technologies provided by employers that are mandated by law already when disabled people are like standing there looking them in the face. And when they're now at home, like what are the odds that the employer is gonna actually provide the technologies that they're required to, especially if you're working on your personal PC. So if I'm working on my personal laptop and I have a personal copy of JAWS, but I'm doing work on it, is my employer required to pay for that copy of JAWS like they would be if I'm in the office on their device? And I wonder if autonomous vehicles as assistive technologies also don't kind of blur this boundary of like, if you are an employer and your employee is disabled and needs an autonomous vehicle in order to commute, you need to pay for it for them? Is that part of the ADA? Is that part of what is required of you to work and what's legally mandated? So that's actually more questions than answers. Not only is that a glorified I don't know, it's a I don't know, but here's a million more things to wonder about.
Those are really good points. Those are really good points. Thank you for bringing those up. So we're approaching the top of the hour. So I think perhaps it's time to wrap up the recorded part of the conversation. Thank you so much, Stacy. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Kevin and Emery. Thank you for answering our questions and having this wonderful conversation. So I'll stop the recording here and then we can keep talking for a bit.
Thank you so much.